Russian Book World.
I'm Konstantin Bulic, and I will be guiding you in the world of recent and perhaps not so recent books from and about Russia. Hello. Vladislav Khodasevich is now considered one of the most important and original Russian poets of the first half of the 20th century. Until now, there had only been sporadic translations of his poetry into English, but Angel Classics has just published a new collection called Vladislav Khodasevich Selected Poems, in Peter Daniels' translation. It gives English-speaking poetry lovers a first substantial selection of Khodasevich's poetry, including verses from his celebrated collections The Way of the Seed and The Heavy Lyre. Born in 1886 in Moscow to parents of Polish and Jewish descent, Khodasevich spent his first 36 years first in Moscow and later in St. Petersburg, by then renamed Petrograd. He made a name for himself as a literary critic and poet. However, he found it impossible to remain in new Soviet Russia for ideological and practical reasons and immigrated in 1922 first to Berlin and later to Paris, where he died shortly before the start of World War II in 1939. Because of his emigration, Vladislav Khodasevich was obliterated from official literary history in the Soviet era, but has since been re-established into Russia's 20th century pantheon of poets. His work as a literary critic and the scholar of the great Russian poet Alexander Pushkin is also now recognized as being of immense value. Although in his time Khodasevich had many admirers, Vladimir Nabokov being one of them, his measured and understated tone was often considered anachronistic by the fellow poets of a more modernist bent. From today's vantage point, however, the classical precision and quiet intensity of his poetry are immensely appealing and relevant to our time. Let us sample a short poem by Vladislav Khodasevich called Look for Me in P.T. Daniels' translation. It was written in 1917.
Look for me in spring's transparent air. I flit like vanishing winds, no heavier than a sound, a breath, a sun ray on the floor. I'm lighter than that ray. It's there. I'm gone. But we are friends forever, undivided. Listen, I'm here. Your hands can feel the way to reach me with their living touch, extended trembling into the restless flame of day. Happen to close your eyelids while you linger. Make me one final effort, and you might find at the nerve ends of each quivering finger brushes of secret fire as I ignite.
And to discuss Vladislav Khodasevich selected poems in our Moscow studio, we have Grigory Petukhov, a Moscow-based poet whose collection of poems called Solo came out in 2011. And from London, we are joined by Peter Daniels, who of course translated Vladislav Khodasevich's poetry for the collection we're discussing today. I should also say that his own collection of poems called Counting Eggs came out also in 2011. Grigory, Peter, welcome to Russian Book World.
Thank you very much.
Grigory, first, it's been just over a quarter of a century since Vladislav Khodasevich's poetry has become freely available and read in Russia. Now, this is a massive question, but perhaps in a few words, could you place Khodasevich in the context of Russian poetry of the 20th century?
Well, to my mind, he's still a very undervalued figure of Russian poetry. He left such a massive heritage in almost every literary genre. His translations of poetry from Stevenson to Chaim Balik and Chernetsky in Yiddish, his wonderful novel, Dzержавин, the homage to the 18th century poetry, and obviously his literary criticism that gives us very precise account of then modern poetry. And of course, as a poet, he is a top-flight precisionist, with his poetry dry, witty, utterly clear, unforgiving, so to speak. I mean, style-wise, his contribution is huge, is massive. All the more reason for crediting him, all based on subtleties, not really tangible at first glance. He sort of dries out his verse, getting rid of any exuberance or even beauty, staying straight to the point and yet very lyrical.
Now, Peter Daniels, turning to you now, could you say how you first encountered Vladislav Khodasevich's poetry? Did you read it first in Russian or English?
It was both, really, because I was reading The Development of Russian Verse by Michael Wachtel, and he used some Khodasevich poems as examples and quoted the Russian and the translation. And the poem that struck me especially was the one called The Dactyls, and that was when I had a fellowship at a place called Hawthornton in Scotland with 4 weeks to write undisturbed, and I wanted to work on some Russian. But I didn't know Khodasevich until then. I started with the Dactyls, and I just kept going because I was so thrilled to discover him, really. He did write quite a few blank verse poems, which of course is unusual in Russian, being unrhymed, though Pushkin did that a little bit. And those poems were also good ones to work with early on because I didn't have to think about the rhyming part, and blank verse is a very English thing.
Could you say a few more words about what it is in Khodasevich's poetry that you find most attractive and unique?
His tone of voice, really. He has this sardonic tone, and he looks at the world rather obliquely, but he is also very passionate, and he had very high standards of honesty. I think that caused him some difficulty with other people in the literary world.
Grigory, turning to you now, I mean, of course, Khodasevich is very much part of what we call the Silver Age of Russian poetry and literature. This is this kind of immense flowering of the arts in fin-de-siècle Russia. And yet he stands quite apart, does he not?
He is a solitary figure, absolutely. He was too late to join the symbolists, even though he was once kind of fascinated with the ideas. Then he was also distant chronologically and geographically from the Acmeists, because they were all from St. Petersburg. He lived in Moscow. He couldn't stand futurism. Futurist embodied the new order of things, which was absolutely unacceptable for him. His first two collections, The Happy Little House and Youth, were just timid sketches. The real Khodasevich starts in 1918, when all the top ranks had already been appointed. Hence his solitude. Everything he created, he did, so to speak, by hand, not using the engines of any movement or literary group.
And Peter, the book we're talking about today, your translations of Khodasevich's poetry, this is the most comprehensive, I understand, collection of Khodasevich's poetry in English now. What guided you in the selection of poems for the collection?
I began by finding poems I liked and could translate. When Angel offered to publish a book, I was given a list of poems that their reader felt were essential. So that gave me a bit of a structure to work with. But I just kept going, really, though there are plenty that I haven't translated that might have gone in. I think we have a good selection, and as Grigory has said, his early work is mostly rather derivative and uninteresting, so there isn't anything very much in the early years. Around 1912, I think he starts to become more interesting as a poet, and then 1918, really, he does something really remarkable.
Russian Book World.
Today I'm joined by two poets in our Moscow studio by Grigory Petukhov and on the line from London by Peter Daniels. We're discussing a new collection of Vladislav Khodasevich's poetry just published by Angel Classics. Peter Daniels did all the translations for the collection, and it is to him that I put my next question. And what were the major challenges for you as a translator? And I'm just wondering whether being a poet yourself was an asset or a hindrance.
Well, the challenge is, I think, I'm really a poet with a certain amount of Russian, so I knew I would need to work with a native Russian speaker to check my work. Otherwise, I'd make embarrassing mistakes and miss important cultural references. But fortunately, I was introduced to Masha Karp, who has been wonderful. I've worked really by showing her my basic versions, and then once I know that those make sense and haven't made anything stupid, I go on to work on it as an English poem. I think of translating poetry as being basically impossible, and that's why I feel motivated to do it. You know, that there's this idea that maybe there's a perfect version of this poem that I've got to find, which is complete nonsense, but that kind of keeps me going. And there is an advantage for a poet in translation, and I began working on translations at a time when I hadn't been writing for quite a while, and I was returning to poetry. And the great thing with translating is that you don't have to wonder what to write about. Someone has already had the inspiration. There is a poem already there, and you've just got to do it all over again. That's the fun part, really.
Was it a challenge for you to render the music, so to say, of Khodasevich's poetry when you were translating him?
Yes, I mean, it is always a challenge, and mostly I have rhymed, but also just being a poet, I do try to write with suitable sound patterns as I would in my own poems, so finding music is what I want to do.
Now, Grigory, this is perhaps a bit crude, but could you flesh out for us the kind of major themes or concerns of Khodasevich's poetry?
I can only try and sketch out a few. Let me start with the quote. Running every verse through prose, twisting out every line, I did engraft the classical rose to the Soviet wilding. This is one of the motives. The new time has come, hectic, disorderly, and his concern is finding the adequate language and perception to reflect in his understanding abominable, decaying modernity. And also the major theme I can think about is that air of the interwar period. He sharply sensed that atomized, aimless existence. Many had just died, and many more were to die. And there was no comfort, no aim, no remedy to that cause. He could really grasp the helplessness in the air as new evil was looming.
Peter, is it your sense as well?
Yes, there is something rather individual view of the world, I think, that he is very sceptical about almost everything.
And for those of our listeners who are perhaps not familiar with Khodasevich's poetry, could you name an English-speaking poet who is, in your view, closest to Khodasevich in some important ways?
Well, it's rather difficult because, of course, the circumstances of their lives are so different. There aren't really British or American poets who have that experience, especially of exile. But I think in terms of the kind of sensibility, you could say perhaps Robert Frost or Edward Thomas or Wilfred Owen, who are from the same kind of period. There's also Louis MacNeice, who was a friend of Auden, and he has influenced me a lot and a lot of other British poets. And I think also in the same kind of way, the American poet Elizabeth Bishop. And those are both poets who have a reputation as what we call poets, which I think is perhaps true of Khodasevich, though I'm sure a wider audience will enjoy him, of course.
Well, to me, style-wise, Alfred Houseman is so much like Khodasevich, the Shropshire lad. It bears the same bent, the same sort of outlook.
Peter, could you say a few words about why it's important to translate poetry in general from other languages?
It's enormously important to know literatures from other languages. I think there's a bit of a difference between poetry and fiction, really, because with fiction, things do disappear. I think it's probably quite hard to make a foreign novel make an appearance in the huge English market. But with poetry, I think people do take more of an interest. And, well, one thing about the huge numbers of people writing in English is that among poets it does make foreign writing more unusual. You know, people can perhaps latch onto it as maybe being a bit exotic or something, but in fact I think there is a lot of interest, real interest in foreign poetry. And I know that because of there are just so many poets writing in English, I can get more attention in the literary world by representing a dead Russian than I can by being a living Englishman, really.
Fascinating. And finally, Peter Daniels, would you kindly read a poem from the collection in your translation for us?
Okay. I'll read one called I Was Born in Moscow, which is a poem that he wrote in the 20s in Paris, but it didn't get published until, I think, as a kind of obituary. It's about his whole situation of being born to a Polish family in Moscow and then having to leave Russia, but having Pushkin as his Russia. So I'll read that now in my translation. I was born in Moscow, saw no smoke above a Polish roof, and my father left to me no locket of his native earth. Stepson to Russia, but to Poland, what could I claim of Poland's love? My homeland, those collected works in 8 small volumes, all I have. For you, the neck beneath the yoke, or else a life of yearning exile. I can carry my own Russia, travelling with me in my hold-all. You must touch your native dust, but wherever I may be, a sacred pair of Moorish lips whispers the fabled land to me.
Wonderful.
Wonderful, absolutely.
Peter Daniels, Grigory Petokhov, thank you so much for being with us on Russian Book World today.
Thank you very much, Konstantin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vladislav Khodasevich, Selected Poems, translated by Peter Daniels, is published by Angel Classics. The program was presented by Konstantin Bulich. Literary consultant for the program was Yelena Rubinova. For now, bye-bye, and do join us next week.